Something about the case did not sit right from the beginning. The timeline seemed fragmented, witness accounts were inconsistent, digital records were strangely incomplete, and in the middle of all of it were two names that investigators kept circling back to again and again: Tommaso Cioni, Dominic Evans. For months, the investigation into the circumstances surrounding Nancy Guthrie remained clouded with uncertainty. There were theories, rumors, fragments of surveillance footage, and long stretches of unanswered questions. But recently, new developments have started shifting the conversation in a direction that many people did not expect. Evidence, according to investigators and analysts reviewing the case, appears to be pointing toward both men in ways that are becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. And what makes this situation even more unsettling is how slowly those pieces came together. At first, neither name stood out prominently. They were mentioned briefly in early investigative documents, appearing almost like background figures in a much larger story. But as forensic teams began examining digital trails, movement patterns, and communication records more carefully, their presence began appearing again and again. One of the earliest turning points came from a routine review of surveillance data collected from the area surrounding the memorial site connected to the case. Investigators were already analyzing footage frame by frame, searching for anything that could clarify the events leading up to the incident. That is when analysts noticed a figure moving through the area, whose posture and gait caught their attention. At first glance, the individual appeared calm, quiet, but behavior specialists who later reviewed the footage pointed out subtle irregularities in the movement pattern. The stride length appeared slightly uneven. The upper body remained unusually rigid. Arm swings seemed limited in a way that did not match the natural rhythm of walking. Those details led analysts to consider the possibility that the person may have been consciously altering their movement. And when the footage was enhanced and cross-referenced with other recordings, investigators began examining whether the individual could be Tommaso Cioni. That possibility alone sparked intense debate among analysts. Gait analysis can be useful, but it is rarely considered definitive proof. Many factors can influence the way a person walks: injury, stress, footwear, terrain, even emotional state. But the investigation did not stop there, because while analysts were studying physical movement, another team was examining something far less visible, but potentially even more important. Modern investigations rely heavily on electronic data. Mobile phone connections, wireless signals, location logs, and network communications often provide a detailed picture of where people were and what they were doing at specific times. In the Nancy Guthrie case, however, investigators encountered something unusual. Several devices that should have recorded consistent connection data appeared to experience brief interruptions around the same time frame that the individual in the surveillance footage passed through the memorial area. Phones disconnected, location signals dropped, wireless activity momentarily vanished. At first, technicians assumed it might be a simple network glitch. Communication networks occasionally experience brief outages. But when analysts mapped the disruption geographically, they noticed something unusual. The signal interruption appeared extremely localized, almost as if something had temporarily blocked wireless communication within a small radius. This discovery led investigators to explore a possibility that sounded almost like something from an espionage story: a signal jammer. Signal jammers are devices designed to block communication signals between electronic devices and their networks. When activated, they create a bubble of interference where phones cannot connect to towers and wireless devices cannot transmit data normally. In many regions, these devices are illegal for civilian use because they can interfere with emergency communication systems. Yet they remain surprisingly easy to obtain through black market channels. The theory that a jammer might have been used near the memorial site quickly raised new questions. If someone carried such a device, it could explain the sudden gaps in digital records. It could also explain why certain phones failed to log location data during that brief window of time. And if someone intended to disrupt digital tracking, that suggested a level of planning. During the analysis of communication records connected to several individuals involved in the case, investigators discovered that Evans had been in contact with multiple people whose devices were present near the memorial area on the same day. That alone did not prove wrongdoing. In many investigations, people communicate with dozens of contacts whose movements happen to overlap geographically. But the frequency and timing of those interactions caught the attention of analysts. Several messages exchanged between Evans and others occurred shortly before the time frame when the digital disruptions were detected. Then, for a short period, communication activity dropped sharply, and after the disruption ended, messaging resumed. Investigators began reconstructing the timeline carefully. The sequence suggested that something unusual had happened during that brief gap. Around the same time, transportation data added another layer to the story. Vehicle tracking systems and nearby traffic cameras indicated that a vehicle associated with Dominic Evans had been moving within a short distance of the memorial area, but when investigators began stacking them together, patterns started to emerge. Movement patterns, communication patterns, digital disruptions, and the presence of individuals whose connections to the case were growing increasingly difficult to dismiss. One of the most intriguing elements of the investigation involves how analysts connected the movements of Tommaso Cioni and Dominic Evans during the critical time frame. Using a combination of surveillance footage, traffic camera data, and partial phone records, investigators constructed a movement map that traced the likely paths of several individuals present in the area. In that reconstruction, the path believed to be taken by Cioni intersected with the region where digital signals temporarily disappeared. Meanwhile, the vehicle linked to Evans appeared to approach the perimeter of that same area shortly before the interruption occurred. That convergence did not immediately prove coordination, but it did raise a question that investigators could not ignore. Were these movements coincidental, or were they connected? At this stage in the investigation, forensic analysts began applying behavioral analysis techniques to the available data. They studied how long individuals remained in certain locations. They measured walking speed and direction from surveillance footage. They analyzed how people entered and exited camera coverage zones, and one particular detail continued to stand out. The individual believed to be Tommaso Cioni appeared to move through the memorial area with an unusual level of awareness of the surrounding cameras. There were moments when the head tilted slightly downward, moments when the body turned slightly away from a lens. These movements were subtle enough that most casual observers would never notice them, but experienced analysts often look specifically for such patterns. Because people who are conscious of surveillance sometimes exhibit micro-adjustments in posture or movement, not dramatic evasive actions, just tiny shifts that suggest awareness. Meanwhile, investigators reviewing financial records connected to Dominic Evans began noticing transactions that added another layer of curiosity. In the weeks leading up to the incident, there were purchases that analysts described as unusual compared to Evans' normal spending patterns. Small electronics, specialized batteries, and equipment commonly associated with portable signal devices. None of those purchases were illegal on their own, but when considered alongside the digital disruptions detected near the memorial site, investigators began exploring whether any of those items could be related to communication interference equipment. Technical specialists were brought in to evaluate that possibility. They explained that portable jammers can sometimes be assembled using relatively common electronic components. With the right configuration, such devices can block cellular, GPS, or wireless signals within a limited range. The effectiveness depends on power level, antenna design, and environmental conditions. In urban environments, interference bubbles can be surprisingly small, which means someone carrying such a device could disrupt signals in a specific location without affecting a wider area. That explanation aligned closely with the localized digital interruption investigators observed. The investigation had reached a stage where multiple threads appeared to converge. A man whose movement through the memorial area attracted attention because of unusual gait patterns. A separate individual whose communications and financial activity suggested possible access to specialized electronic equipment, and a digital anomaly that appeared precisely when those movements occurred. Even so, investigators remained cautious. Because building a case requires more than correlations, it requires evidence that withstands scrutiny in courtrooms, not just speculation in documentaries. So forensic teams continued digging deeper. They examined additional surveillance cameras from surrounding streets. They analyzed radio frequency data collected by nearby communication towers. They reviewed witness statements from people who had been present near the memorial site that day. One witness described seeing a man standing briefly near the edge of the memorial walkway, appearing to adjust something inside a bag. Another recalled noticing a vehicle idling unusually close to a restricted area entrance. These accounts were not definitive. Human memory is often unreliable, especially when recalling ordinary moments that only later become significant. But they added context to the growing timeline investigators were constructing. As the pieces slowly came together, analysts began asking a central question. If Tommaso Cioni and Dominic Evans were both present in the broader area around the same time, what was the nature of their connection? Phone records indicated that the two had communicated in the past, but enough to establish that they were not strangers. That discovery led investigators to examine earlier interactions between them, emails, messages, social connections, and while many of those interactions appeared ordinary, some analysts believe they reveal a pattern of coordination that may have existed before the incident ever occurred. Whether that coordination was related to the Guthrie case remains one of the most critical questions investigators continue to pursue. And that is where the story currently stands. Evidence that does not yet form a complete picture, but which increasingly points toward two individuals whose roles may be more significant than originally believed. The investigation is still unfolding. More digital records are being analyzed. Additional witnesses may come forward, and forensic specialists continue examining every available fragment of data. Because cases like this rarely resolve through a single dramatic discovery, instead, a signal interruption, a surveillance clip, a financial record, a message timestamp. Each clue by itself might seem small, but together, they begin forming a narrative that investigators cannot ignore. And in the Nancy Guthrie case, that narrative is now drawing intense attention toward Tommaso Cioni and Dominic Evans. Whether that attention ultimately leads to definitive conclusions remains to be seen. But one thing is certain: the deeper investigators look into the patterns surrounding this case, the clearer it becomes that the truth may be far more complex than anyone first imagined. And sometimes, the most important breakthroughs do not arrive with dramatic announcements. They arrive quietly, hidden inside data logs, inside surveillance frames, inside the subtle movements of people who may have believed no one was watching, until someone finally started looking closely enough.